This video is largely about Rembrandt's drawings, but Rembrandt was also the most prolific etcher and also, of course, a painter. And the act of drawing is really best described as dividing a two-dimensional surface into areas. The areas can be defined with lines, as drawings usually do, with tone, or with color in painting. It's all drawing, and drawing is understood to be the most important aspect of an artist's life. With Rembrandt, undoubtedly, drawing was very experimental. He allowed himself an enormous long leash from being really absolutely slapdash to so refined, so thoughtful, that his brilliance is just astounding when one comes to the great drawings. Perhaps 100 great drawings out of 2,000, either goodish or even baddish. To talk about lines is to displace attention from the volumes that Rembrandt is using to talk about his attitude to life. Life is in 3 dimensions. Lines are in 2 dimensions. They're talking about handwriting, where style, for instance, if we talk about the style of Dickens, we're talking about his whole attitude to life. And Rembrandt deserves the same treatment. Rembrandt drawing from imagination, for instance. Rembrandt draws St. Paul from life and his crowd entirely from imagination. Is really surprisingly bad. In fact, I think that he deliberately drew flying angels, for instance, which you can't draw from life. He deliberately drew as worthless, because he often said that anything other than drawing from life was worthless. And he illustrated that on very many occasions. It's quite amazing. Rembrandt trying to draw from imagination is also really surprisingly inadequate. There are many illustrators who can do it very well. Rembrandt didn't believe in inventing, and it did it remarkably badly, even when he seemed to be trying. For instance, there's a drawing of Jupiter with Philemon and Baucis, which is undoubtedly a really mediocre drawing. And he has to make, we know it's by Rembrandt because he makes a note on the paper in his own handwriting, trying to tell us the story better than the drawing does. As an example of Rembrandt's difficulty with making things up, this baby's bottom is probably a very good example. It's clearly spent a lot of time trying to make it okay, but it isn't okay. He's done rather better with the eagle. But in his painting that resulted from this original drawing, he got it right. And this is Rembrandt. He is really, on occasions, he's remarkably humble. He doesn't, somebody like Michelangelo actually destroyed anything that didn't do him enormous credit. And in fact, even with Michelangelo, there are quite a lot of pretty mediocre drawings. But Rembrandt left us everything that he produced, more or less. He didn't have the bonfires that Michelangelo was absolutely famous for, although he actually dissected corpses to understand the musculature. It's so complicated that he had to make these small 3-dimensional modelled from life in the poses he needed. He couldn't remember precisely what he'd dissected. It's what we regard as imagination is often memory aided by reality. That's the point. That Rembrandt aided his memory by having reality in front of him, almost always. Michelangelo aided his with maquettes. Raphael aided his with a mental image based on the lay figure. which was very useful. He manipulated better than anybody else, but it's not imagination. Rembrandt was known as the first heretic in art, and he was a heretic in two senses. First of all, he didn't go to Italy to study art, as everyone of serious importance did, other than Rembrandt. It was the standard way of studying art. You went to Italy to do so. The other way in which Rembrandt was a heretic is that he was a first-generation Protestant. That means that he was reading the Bible in his native language for this first time, and he read it with enormous care, and his best illustrations are the best that's ever been done. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Not from the point of view of finish, because Rembrandt simply wasn't interested in finish in his drawings. He didn't see them as something that could be sold. He was experimenting. He was cutting his drawings up, rearranging the space between figures. He was drawing some things with no interest whatsoever, but just because they were there. And he varies from being very slapdash to exquisite. And you just have to accept him as he is. That's Rembrandt for you. You can't expect him to be truly consistent. He was enormously varied, which of course is the opposite of being consistent. All these drawings of blessings are obviously drawn from the same group of individuals. They appear very different because they're drawn with different pens, essentially. I can go further. The date of this further drawing is, I've proved, is a mirror image of the same group, and Benish has dated it 1661. That is 21 years later than the original drawings. I mean, it's completely crazy. Art historians must reunite these drawings grouped under the idea of blessings rather than style. They've got style so absurdly wrong, they have to just ditch it for the moment. If we look at Rembrandt's paintings, there is a development of style, but in painting he's always using oil paint, brushes, palette knife. It's all the same material, and he's just using it in a broader and broader way, which is absolutely valid to know about. But for drawings, I suggest they put aside the whole idea of an evolution of drawings until they know a great deal more about it. I think that Scotland Yard would help much more. Another way in which Rembrandt was a heretic is he was a younger artist than Rubens. And of course, he was a Protestant and Rubens was a Catholic. Rubens had an enormous clientele. It was the Counter-Reformation, and he was doing exactly what the Counter-Reformation wanted. He was the first port of call for those who could afford him. He had to have a very competent collection of assistants, including someone as brilliant as Van Dyck, for instance, working for him, because of this enormous pressure to produce work. And Rembrandt, Descent from the Cross, some people have described this as a kind of bow to Rubens, but on the contrary, I describe it as a fierce criticism of Rubens. This is what it really looked like, Rembrandt is telling us, not this overflowing altarpiece that Rubens had done for Antwerp. I mean, a fantastic painting of its kind, but so over the top in terms of drama and emotion and so on. Rembrandt's is also very emotional, but much truer to Rembrandt's feeling for humanity. The third way in which Rembrandt was not a heretic, he was following a very steady tradition, but it's one that art historians don't really understand. It's all to do with Roman three-dimensional geometry. And I've been ploughing that field for half a century without making any effect on the establishment art historians. They simply don't understand it. They understand the Greek tradition, more or less, as described by the Renaissance artists. They did it incredibly well. But Rembrandt was interested in psychological relationships before everything else. And he uses Roman geometry in a way that the establishment art historians, particularly the Rembrandt scholars, simply don't understand at all. It's a long tradition. Somebody like Masaccio, Mantegna, Holbein, they all came before him, and they were all doing it absolutely brilliantly. Rembrandt took Roman geometry and took it a lot further, where those three were describing the solid flesh in front of them with remarkable accuracy and brilliance. Rembrandt expanded the geometry to include human relationships, that is, two figures, and they're held together in an observed space which is essentially based on three-dimensional geometry. I've made a video of a drawing by Rembrandt of his mistress, Hendrika Stoffels, and trying to explain how he actually puts the whole figure into a block or a box, if you like, in which movements can be described with remarkable accuracy and truthfulness. And I regarded that particular drawing as a canonical masterpiece, a really, really important drawing. This masterpiece is now attributed to Gelder. De Gelder was an amateur painter who did study with Hoogstraten for 2 years. We're less sure whether he worked with Rembrandt at any time, but he's certainly not capable of this. And can you imagine Rembrandt inviting him into his bedroom to draw from his naked mistress, which matches up with another drawing which they accept, which is inferior, in fact. And they simply don't see the enormous importance, the enormous originality of Rembrandt as a draftsman. And really, you have to see that video. It's about 2 drawings by Rembrandt, one of which has been dismissed, and one of which, the lesser good one, is accepted. You will find those drawings on the front and back cover of a recent Getty museum about Rembrandt. I mean, the situation is disastrous, and the establishment has gone on teaching falsehoods in high places since I discovered the truth about Rembrandt, use of mirrors, which insists that he was drawing from life, and which the article was rejected twice by an important magazine. But Gombrich, who was even more important, insisted on it being published. And he helped me to put it in a way that would be less offensive to the establishment. But the establishment has taken no notice whatsoever, nonetheless. So that article more or less demolished Rembrandt Scholarship as it existed then, and it hasn't changed much today. It demolished it in important ways. First of all, Rembrandt scholars and other scholars have always admired imagination and invention over observation, and Rembrandt is exactly the opposite of that. Rembrandt evolution as a draftsman was shown to be complete nonsense. And a further large quantity of literature called the iconography of Rembrandt's school was shown to be also very suspect, because I'd shown that there were a group of real models there, and of course in a life class Each student has his own physical viewpoint, which is different to other people's. And so it shows that what the scholars had regarded as philosophical differences among the students was better explained, really, by their physical different viewpoints. This made a nightmare for Rembrandt Scholarship, from which they could either reform in a very, very deep way or resist. And unfortunately, they've chosen to resist. And of course, it is in the psychological space that Rembrandt observes so very, very well that is his major claim to being the most important artist ever. I mean, somebody like Eisenstein looked to Rembrandt to see how to express human relationships. And that is, with Rembrandt, the space is always observed, but it is seen with his shorthand type drawing, his own invention, if you like, but a convention that is extremely useful. If you look at the drawings of Giacometti, for instance, I came to understand Rembrandt through the drawings of Giacometti. Giacometti has nothing like Rembrandt's insight, but he's so only interested in space. And unlike Rembrandt, he's hardly interested in the solid at all. He just gives us space clues based on architecture or on sculpture stands in his studio and things of that sort. Or he'll draw beautifully a chandelier above a table. Fantastically good drawings telling us about space. And Rembrandt is the master of space. Previous Renaissance artists had, of course, used space in a kind of theatrical way. They draw a receding pavement in perspective, and Raphael will put figures across that pavement in a remarkably convincing way. But when it comes to really intimate space between people, Rembrandt is by far the best, simply because he observed it. But he observed it in a language that he invented. These are all drawings of an old man in a bed giving a blessing. And they all look alike, and undoubtedly they're done probably with the same pen and the same paper. And the thing is, all these people in the drawings, particularly this old lady here, you can recognize her time and time again. She's very, very recognizable. The old man is slightly less recognizable. This one, I've actually proved that it's a mirror image of the same group, which is in Chatsworth and was bought from one of Rembrandt's most successful students. And I regarded that particular drawing as a masterpiece. This is nothing like so good, but it is a reversal of a different view of exactly the same three-dimensional group. And therefore, it certainly was done on the same day, or nearly the same day, as a drawing which has been dismissed in spite of its very good provenance and in spite of its genius.
I was convinced both were drawn from the same reality. I made this model based on the David and Solomon drawing, fully expecting to be able to walk around to the other side of the bed and there see the position from which Rembrandt drew the Isaac and Jacob. What I actually found was the reverse of that situation. Because I was convinced that the models group were the same, I searched around for some explanation for this, and of course a mirror presented itself as a fairly obvious possibility. And as soon as I inserted the mirror, of course, the whole thing fell into place very quickly. You find that her head and his head relate perfectly. even this man's head, who is not relevant to the Isaac and Jacob story, starts as a head and one feels has been turned into a jug or bowl of flowers on a table, which are his shoulders. The only thing that didn't completely work was that the Solomon had to move forward onto the platform we've already seen to become the Jacob in the other drawing.
What this shows is how very different Rembrandt can be when he's responding to live models that he's set up in a very distinct psychological situation, and the reflection, the reversed reflection of that group of models when he is observing in a rather dim mirror, probably made of polished metal.
Rembrandt actually recreated reality in his studio. I have, for instance, made these two maquettes and shown that Rembrandt drew from two live models in front of a mirror. There are 4 drawings by Rembrandt of a supposed pageant that took place in 1638, of which these 4 musicians are one. Now, the proof that the mirror was used is very simple. The nearest flautist is playing his flute the wrong way round, left-handedly. The one next to him, deeper into the picture space, is playing it the right way round, reflected in the mirror, that is. The 2 oboe-type instruments, one sees the angle at which they come together is exactly as we see in the reflection. So that though the technique of the drawing is very complicated, Rembrandt's used pen, wash, chalk, and even a little bit of body colour, so that it was certainly done in his studio. The subject matter, on the other hand, suggests that it was from this pageant, that therefore we put 2 and 2 together and we expect Rembrandt to have a photographic memory. What my discovery really proves is that that is not so. He would not have bothered to recreate this thing in the studio, and the mirror proves that it was recreated in the studio if he had a photographic memory. So that this discovery shows him not to be some extraordinary Superman, but somebody who went to a great deal of trouble to recreate in his studio the tableau vivant which he then drew. If we then go on to look at this mummer, 2 mummers riding together, we find very much the same sort of thing, that the second mummer has had a different kind of feather made up, and it resembles that of the second flautist very much in the actual technique. He's given a flat hat rather than a pointed or tall hat, and that's the only difference. We then go to the 4th drawing, and we find, in fact, that what Rembrandt has done is he's walked round the subject as he'd set it up in his studio and made a second drawing, this time simply of one figure. But that one figure matches up with the first mummer in a way which is quite wonderful, really, from my point of view. He wears the same tall hat. He has a plume sticking out of the same side of that hat. He's wearing the same kind of collar, the same kind of sleeve, the same kind of cape going over his back, and he's got a sword which crosses the horse's back in exactly the same way in both drawings. That is, the reality from which it came is the same.
I've made a video about this, and I've taken it apart to show how wonderful the drawing underneath is. This is described by Benish as Rembrandt correcting a pupil, but in fact, drawing underneath is beautiful Rembrandt, very careful and exquisite piece of drawing. And the corrections, of course, are by himself. He's simply trying a new moment in the Bible. But as I have made a separate video on that, all I will do here is At the end of this section, I will put up all the video links necessary to go deeper into the understanding of what has gone wrong. The experts want Rembrandt to be bold. This exquisite drawing by Rembrandt is a preparatory drawing for his painting of the Adoration in Munich. It is not included in Behnisch, not even as a once attributed to Rembrandt. This drawing was attributed to Rembrandt by the first cataloguers. I would include it in the top 20 drawings by Rembrandt. In this etching of 1652, Rembrandt shows he's not limited to bold strokes. It's an incredibly beautiful, incredibly careful drawing. So Wolflin published his book in 1915, and it didn't take long for art historians to collapse into a state of not really deciding on quality, but simply on style. Style may interest them, but it isn't of much interest to either artists or the general public. It's to know precisely when Rembrandt drew something is not that interesting to us. What we want to know really is why it's any good, or if it's not very good, why it isn't very good. And that's what I'm telling you. But in doing so, he started a kind of post-Darwinian idea of how style develops in a civilization, or in Rembrandt's case, in an individual, how he developed as a draftsman. Now, if his understanding had been a little bit deeper, it might have been quite useful. But what I have shown as early as 1977 in an article that was refused twice by the Burlington, but Gombrich insisted that it should be published. And as a result, it was published. It showed the full failure of Rembrandt scholarship, but has had absolutely no effect on the establishment's view. The establishment remained fixed in its view, in spite of what I regard as absolutely solid proof that they're talking nonsense. Wolflin gave rise to a kind of post-Darwinian idea of art evolving. Not a bad idea. And the first essay in this new scholarship was written by Gisela Richter about the development of Greek sculpture. It was a huge success, and it deserved to be. It showed very clearly how Greek sculpture had developed. And although I don't believe it all, it did have a very simplifying effect of showing how gradually Greek art moved from a fairly basic and highly provincial copy of Egyptian art to the classical art that we admire so much today. Now, we don't know many of the dates of these sculptures. They can be guessed, but it is a huge convenience to have this general idea about Greek sculpture, which in itself is true. The actual details of which sculpture was done when hardly matters. She certainly shows a development, and I don't expect that all her ideas are correct, but the overall idea is certainly correct. When it comes to Behnisch's efforts to do the same for Rembrandt with his catalogue raisonné of 1954, the result is a total disaster. And it's a disaster which has gone on and on and on. Behnisch has divided groups of recognizable models working together by a matter of 20 or 30 years in some cases. The scholars of today are infinitely worse than Behnisch. Behnisch did have a good eye, there's no doubt about that. He was the son of a very famous connoisseur collector, and he had obviously learnt a great deal from his father, which makes his catalogue by far the best example of scholarship to which scholars have to return now. But the disaster is he imposes dates on drawings. Rembrandt dated his etchings pretty thoroughly. His drawings he always regarded as a private affair, unsaleable, and therefore he looked after them, but he didn't expect to sell them. He kept them in books on the basis of subject matter. And therefore we have a huge supply of drawings that could or could not be by Rembrandt. Their present ideas of how to decide which is which are completely crazy. There's no other word for it. They are insisting that their ideas about the development of style are correct. I showed in 1977 that they were complete nonsense. If they'd got Rembrandt's style correct, it might be of some interest. But as they got it completely wrong, based on fantasy, it's incredibly destructive. Furthermore, their ideas about quality are way, way wide of the mark. Benish loves Rembrandt to be making bold strokes. He seems to say a powerful drawing is one with lots and lots of thick ink marks on it. This is a commemorative etching done after the man died in 1638. He certainly didn't sit for Rembrandt, and it isn't a particularly strong character. Rembrandt has made the best of resurrecting him by giving his hand a shadow, which brings it beyond the frame. There's a shadow of his head there. It's a clever idea, but one couldn't really call it powerful in any way. Lots of Rembrandt's heavily inked drawings are absolute rubbish, really. They have no idea. I mean, this dreadful fake has been hailed as a powerful drawing. Professor Slive of Harvard calls this a masterful figure study built up almost entirely of vertical, horizontal, and diagonal lines. If the experts could redirect their attention from lines to volumes in space, we might hope that their pronouncements on drawings would improve. It's absolutely breathtaking. These are not the dregs of scholarship. These are the crème de la crème, people picked out to deal with one of the greatest masters ever. And they simply don't know what they're talking about. Any teenager preparing for O-levels in art or art history should not be deceived by such a drawing. I hardly call it a drawing at all. It has none of the qualities that I look for in a drawing, and I'm not alone in looking for those qualities. They have, because Rembrandt is such a really important icon for artists, or certainly was in my youth, their mistakes have had a catastrophic effect on the quality of drawing. What is powerful about a work of art is how it educates and refines our perception of life. A very important function indeed. It's why art has been valued over the centuries. Nowadays, we've substituted what I would call decorative art. That is, it doesn't refer to human life or relationships. It is making pretty patterns.